This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week, I'm delighted to be chatting with returning guest Dave Goulson about his latest research, which he covers in his new book, Eat the Planet Well. It's a practical guide to eating in a way that's healthy, affordable and kind to the planet. And honestly, even if you think you know this stuff and you're wondering why the departure from Dave's usual nature writing, there's loads in here to interest and surprise you.
You know, we all want to eat a healthy diet. Most people are concerned about affordability these days. And at the same time, it would be nice to know that the food we ate had a relatively small kind of planetary footprint. And it's really hard to, when you go shopping, go to the supermarkets or wherever, to juggle all these different things. So what I've tried to do is provide a kind of practical guide, if you like, as to how to eat well and at the same time as minimizing your impact on the planet, and to try and also take into account the whole affordability issue. So it's I really hope people will find it useful.
I'm sure they will. It is a bit of a departure from some of your previous books. Why did you feel the need to shift away from writing about nature and bees and gardening and all the rest of it?
My usual territory of bees and other insects and so on. Yeah, well, it's all linked together. It might seem like quite a leap, but I guess the way I came at this really was that, sadly, the kind of food system the modern industrial farming system, reliant on lots of chemical inputs and heavily mechanized huge fields and all that, is the main driver of bee declines, and not just bee declines, but of biodiversity loss globally. And also it's a massive contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It's damaging soils. Got 40% of the world's soils now badly eroded, according to the World Health Organization. So if we want to stop bees declining, if we want to look after the planet better, then we need to look at how we grow food and what we eat ultimately. And every shopping choice you make, everything you throw in your trolley at the supermarket or wherever else you might get your food, has an impact. But it could be a really small impact, or it might be quite a big impact, depending on what it is. And so it's basically ultimately comes back to looking after the planet better. And to do that, we need to think carefully about what we eat, because what we eat is one of the biggest impacts we have as beings on this planet.
Yeah, and as you say, I think probably the people who are familiar with your books or are interested in the natural world, they're kind of like a very good target market for this message, I think. Do you? Because they're already conscious about their actions.
Well, I hope so. I mean, that said, of course, there's always a danger that you end up in a kind of bubble preaching to the converted. But I'm pretty sure there's a lot of stuff in there that even my kind of regular readers will find is new to them. There's quite a lot of things that I discovered myself when I was writing this book. Just as an example, everyone's very obsessed by food miles. It's one of the first things that comes up when people think about shopping choices and, what to avoid. But actually, food miles really aren't a big deal. Transport costs of foods only contribute about 6% of the overall carbon emissions associated with food production. And many foods that come from quite a long way away, a very long way away, can actually have a pretty low transport cost if they're shipped or carried over land rather than air freighted, which is actually rather little food is air freighted. So people shouldn't be obsessing about food miles. There are many other far more important factors at play that affect the environmental impact of the foods we eat.
I like to think that I'm fairly sort of conscious about my food choices, and, I'm very keen on reducing, my sort of environmental footprint. And there was a lot of stuff that I found really surprising in there still, even though I feel like I'm fairly well educated around it. And as you say, the sort of agricultural side of things is what is causing a knock-on effect for biodiversity. Is that the main driver of sort of biodiversity issues when it comes to food? Or what kind of struck me when I was reading it was actually it's all quite broken. And it's a very big question to ask, but why do you think that it is just in such a state basically at the moment?
It's hard to explain why we've ended up with such a ridiculous system. I mean, I guess it's been driven by profit rather than what's good for the people or good for the planet. Because, I mean, I've already mentioned how food production has a huge environmental footprint. And, by far the biggest land use globally is farming. And hence, it's having a huge impact. And it's really important that we try to lessen that impact, particularly as the human population grows. But there's more problems with the food system than that. And aside from being bad for the environment, basically we're eating ourselves unwell at the moment. We're on average eating really poorly, and this is familiar territory to most people. But the modern food system provides us. It's based on a very small number of crops globally, most of which are heavily processed into foods which are really not good for us at all, which is driving this epidemic of obesity and ill health, diabetes and heart disease and so on. And this isn't just a first world problem, this is a global issue. Massive increases in obesity rates, for example, in most of Asia. So we've invented a food system which is ravaging the planet and killing us, which is pretty dumb. Surely we can do better. And the frustrating thing is we can, it wouldn't actually be that hard to massively reduce our overall food footprint and to support more sustainable methods of farming and at the same time make ourselves healthier. It's all completely doable. It just requires us to change what we eat, essentially.
Yeah, and one of those things I get the sense, that is important is growing our own food. I think that's a big part of it. And I kind of asked this question as like a reformed puritanical ornamental grower. I was just like, it's got to be flowers or nothing at all. And now I'm very much like, oh, well, if it's not edible, does it have a place in my garden? And the question that comes off that is, is there any excuse really why gardeners shouldn't be growing food?
I suppose I don't want to be too puritanical either and, insist that everyone must get out their spade and start growing food in the garden. But it would help if people did, or if more people did. It's surprisingly easy to grow food in a garden. And, if you've never tried it, give it a go. I love growing food in my own garden, and I try to grow as much as I possibly can. I'm lucky I've got a big garden, which helps. But quite a big chunk of our food comes from the back garden, and which is all, grown without pesticides in a way that supports biodiversity, and it's really super fresh and nutritious. So why wouldn't you want to grow a bit of fresh food in your garden? And I do think we should encourage people to do that wherever possible. And maybe this is something government could play a part in. It's sort of a public information campaign about the benefits of growing your own food. Encouraging people who haven't got gardens to get allotments and providing the land for that, because this may be a bit of a side issue, but there's 100,000 people nationally on waiting lists for allotments. And so those are people who want to be growing their own low impact, healthy food, but can't because they can't get hold of the land, which is really frustrating and something that we should look into. So I'm a big fan of home growing, be it in gardens or allotments. And I think one of the reasons that I'm so keen on it is it illustrates that food production doesn't have to be bad for the planet. There's really good evidence that gardens and allotments are rich in biodiversity. They can support literally thousands of species of animals and plants, mostly insects. And they generally have much healthier soils than farmland soils, much higher in carbon, so they're storing carbon. And there's really clear evidence that people who grow their own food are healthier than people who don't grow their own food. So it's good for the planet, it's good for us. It's tackling climate change. It shows that food production can be a benign activity, and that's the complete opposite of the sort of industrial farming model where essentially producing food and supporting life are kind of mutually exclusive. Farming is done in a way which basically drives pretty much all wildlife, all biodiversity out of the landscape. But it doesn't have to be like that. And allotments and gardens where people grow veggies for themselves demonstrate that really nicely.
Yeah, and it's, it's a cost saving thing as well. And you mentioned organic and sort of soil health. And there was something in the book that surprised me, which was where you said about organic and regenerative agriculture farms do see a decrease in output, but an increase in profits. And I wondered, is that because they are passing that kind of cost on to the consumer, or is there another reason for that?
It varies depending on the farm, and it's probably not universally true to say that organic farms are more profitable, but there's plenty of evidence that they often are. And I guess there's two real drivers there. One is that they can charge a premium for the food, and buying organic is usually more expensive. Some organic foods, particularly meats, are really expensive, and so that kind of limits who can afford them. But the other financial benefit for the farmer is obviously that he or she would spend less on inputs. They don't have all the chemical fertilizers which are rocketing in price right now, and all the pesticides that are used in an industrial farm. They cost a lot of money. And so by reducing your expenditure, you, as an organic farmer, it helps to improve profitability.
There's the issue as well at the moment, I think personally, and I think probably other people are worrying about it, with supply chain issues. And obviously, if we're buying more locally and, we're not transporting food and we're growing in a more sustainable way that doesn't rely on things like you say, the synthetic fertilizers and stuff, I'm guessing that makes our food systems more secure.
Yes, I mean, there's clearly, with the sort of troubled world we live in at the moment, it makes sense for us to grow as much as we can locally. And something else which seems to be fundamentally foolish in terms of the overall food system is, in the UK, we could grow lots of the fruits and vegetables that we consume. We have a climate that's pretty good for growing a lot of different fruits and veg, but we grow very little. We import about 70% of our fruit and veg. And that's simply not necessary. I mean, obviously, there are some things we can't grow in Britain, but there are plenty of things we can. And I mean, even things like apples, which grow beautifully in the United Kingdom. We grubbed up most of the apple orchards that we used to have in this country, and now we import most of our apples. So from a food security point of view, it would make sense to grow more stuff ourselves in a way that we can control, and also to grow it in a way that's sustainable rather than just doing more of the industrial model farming.
And when you talk about the industrial model farming, I think possibly the argument is used that, we need that style of farming. And even if we're doing something like rewilding and, harvesting meat from as a byproduct of that, there is this sense still, I think, that we need to manage our environment, manage the countryside. And if we get a bit more hands off or change our methods of farming, then there's the danger that we might lose a bit of control over the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I fundamentally, I think, disagree with the idea that we have to be in control. And it almost harks back to some kind of religious idea that God put man in charge of the planet or something, which I fundamentally disagree with. Nature does really well without us. Rewilding projects are a good example of that. It doesn't need to be managed. That said, I am a big fan of rewilding. I love going to rewilding projects. I'm not too far from Knepp, where I live, and it's a fantastic place, but it produces precious little food. It does produce a bit of beef and pork, but we couldn't feed the growing human population on the planet. If we rewilded all our farmland, we'd all starve. So rewilding is great, but we need to think carefully and strategically about where it ought to happen. And the obvious answer is places that aren't much good for food production. So perhaps some of the uplands of Britain, areas with infertile soils. And in fact, the Knepp project in West Sussex is on a really heavy clay soil, which isn't very productive for arable farming, which is why they converted to rewilding in the first place. So nature, just to recap, I think nature can look after itself perfectly well. It doesn't need us. But if we're going to grow food, then we do need to manage the landscape, but we don't need to do it in an industrial way with huge numbers of chemical inputs and massive impacts on the planet. There are much more sustainable ways of growing food and of providing us with a healthy, nutritious diet.
One of the things you mentioned in the book, which again was a surprise to me, was the assurance schemes that are out there that people should be looking for when they're buying food. Is that something that you can just explain a little bit about?
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated, the labeling, and I think we all get a bit bewildered when, if you're in a shop and you see there are umpteen different assurance schemes, labeling schemes, some of which are meaningful and some of which aren't seemingly very meaningful. And perhaps fish is a good example. There are lots of different sort of labels put on packets of frozen fish or fresh fish for that matter. You can get, for example, sustainably sourced labels, which I looked into and as far as I could tell mean basically nothing at all. I couldn't really understand what they were guaranteeing. On the other hand, the MSC label, the Marine Stewardship Council label, seems to be, it's got its critics, but it seems to be a pretty useful guide to fish that is being sustainably managed. And so some people would argue that we shouldn't eat any fish, that it's fundamentally not sustainable, but actually it is sustainable so long as we limit catches so that fish stocks can remain stable and replenish themselves every year. And there are some fish stocks in the world which are doing fine, many others that aren't, that are being heavily overfished. And so using the MSC label to identify the ones that you can eat with a relatively clear conscience is a good thing to do. But it's knowing which of these labels are actually useful and which ones are just marketing bullshit, essentially, that is quite tricky.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I've always liked about your work is that you analyse stuff really fairly and thoroughly and you always offer a very balanced perspective at the end of it. And it's brilliant because people can make their own informed choices off the back of it. The other thing I think that you never do is scaremonger, but you're honest and, like I say, very sort of fair, but offering positive solutions. But one of the things I always think is there is a very fine line between everybody reading a book like yours and going, oh my God, I'm doing it completely wrong, like I've got to change everything, and then being overwhelmed because there's so much that's currently wrong with the system that we need to try and fix. So I thought a really good sort of starting point was if you said to people, do one thing or don't do one thing, and that will make a positive change. What do you think would be your most important thing that you could suggest?
This is probably a predictable answer, but probably the biggest single thing you can do is reduce your meat intake. The planetary footprint associated on average with producing particularly beef and lamb is huge compared to almost any other food you might care to eat. And I say this as someone who still does eat some meat. So I'm not a vegetarian or vegan myself, but the planet would be better off if we all were vegetarian or vegan, it must be said. But I'm not trying to persuade people to become vegetarian. I think just cutting down, don't have meat every day. Try and have it maybe once or twice a week. There are lots of alternatives that are really tasty once you get the hang of cooking with them. And if everyone did that, it would make a massive difference to the global ecosystem and allow us to set aside huge areas of land for nature or carbon capture or tourism or whatever you want.
So the vegan diet especially is, a lot of people level the charge at it that it's full of processed food, which it can be if you're looking at sort of...
It doesn't have to be, does it?
It doesn't at all, no. And that's what I was going to say. So you sort of, again, look into that processed part of food. You go into GMOs. In fact, can you sort of give an overview of that?
Yeah, I've done quite a lot of work over the years on pesticides, and I think we massively overuse pesticides. And I guess people might expect me to also be quite negative about GMOs, but I do think they could be useful. Genetic modification could be used to reduce chemical inputs, for example, by making plants unpalatable to pest insects, so you don't have to spray an insecticide. So they could be associated with a big reduction in pesticide use, which would benefit the planet. But that's very rarely how it actually works. By far the majority of genetically modified crops in the world are ones that have been rendered tolerant to herbicides like glyphosate, which means the farmer can spray more herbicide without any danger of him killing his own crop than a farmer growing conventional crops, which would be killed by the herbicide. So glyphosate production has massively increased, all around the world. And I would argue it's pretty nasty stuff. The World Health Organization lists it as a probable carcinogen. There's pretty clear evidence that it's harmful to the environment, particularly to soil. So GM crops that are resistant to glyphosate have allowed a massive increase in use of pesticides. So far from benefiting the environment, they've harmed the environment. So I think it's basically the technology is being misused by people who are trying to make money rather than trying to genetically modify crops to benefit farmers or people or the environment. If, for example, you wanted to genetically engineer crops to make them more nutritious, to increase levels of vitamins, or to improve salt tolerance so that you could grow foods in soils that are high in salt, that could be really useful in helping to feed the planet in a sustainable way. But that, on the whole, isn't what's happening at present, sadly. I don't think GM is inherently evil, as some people think it is. I think it's the people using it that are the problem very often, or the people generating these GM crops. They're doing it for the wrong reasons.
The other thing that you mentioned, which I found fascinating and I thought really had a lot of potential, was the precision fermentation. I don't know if many people listening will have heard of that, so perhaps you could explain it. But also, I wondered, is it ever going to be possible on a domestic scale, do you think?
I don't know about a domestic scale, but it seems to have huge promise. I mean, in theory, you can genetically engineer yeasts or bacteria to manufacture more or less anything you want. So you could feed them on some source of carbohydrate, could be almost any crop, wheat, rice, whatever, and get them to produce protein, for example, which you then filter out the bacteria from your fermentation vat and dry them out, and you've got a source of really cheap, low impact protein that could be formulated into, some kind of protein burger or whatever. There are trials of this underway, and it seems to offer the potential to produce relatively huge amounts of food from a tiny area of land. The flip side, of course, is that it's producing something which is not a natural food. It could be argued is an ultra-processed food. I think it probably would have to be classified as ultra-processed. And you'd want to be really sure that it was healthy. But given the human population growth and the huge pressures that rolling out ever more industrial farming will bring to bear on the environment, then these sort of radical alternatives are certainly worth investigating, and could be a real game changer. If we could produce huge amounts of food from a small amount of cropland fed into biofermentation reactors, then, perhaps that's something we should take seriously and explore.
Yeah, definitely. So my final question to you, and I'm going to ask you to get your crystal ball out, which you probably don't like doing as scientists, but it's basically this. What's going to come first? Is it going to be us changing our ways, or is it going to be us facing like crises that push us into chaos and kind of no other option, really?
I wish I knew. Boy, that's a tricky one. I mean, we're already facing crises. I think arguably some of the chaos that's going on around the world is driven by the beginnings of a kind of environmental collapse. The climate change is already starting to cause all sorts of problems around the world. And the social unrest that we see in many countries, the support for populist politicians, is driven by declining living standards to a large extent. People are living in a world where their children are probably going to be poorer than they were, which is something that hasn't happened for centuries. And it makes people deeply unhappy and likely to vote against conventional politicians. So we're already in the beginnings of a sort of chaotic world, at least in part induced by the environmental problems we're creating. Whether we can find our way out of it fast enough, I really don't know. I mean, we all have to be hopeful, and we all have to do everything we can to push for a more sustainable future and hope we achieve it. But it's not a sort of win-lose scenario, is it really? I mean, everything we can do to make the future a tiny bit better is worth doing, even if the future may be quite challenging in many ways, and I suspect it will be. But, giving up isn't an option at this stage. That really would be disastrous. So we can all make a difference, and I think that's a key message. So, think about what you buy, your personal impact on the planet, and if we all do our best to minimise that, at least it's going to be a step in the right direction.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Dave for such a thoughtful and wide-ranging chat. If today's episode has got you thinking more deeply about how our food choices shape the natural world, you might also enjoy episode 334, Food Farming Revolutionary, and episode 324, Kitchen Garden Living. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny, but first a word from our sponsors at roastinghouse.co.uk. Get 25% extra free if you mention Roots and All or Insect of the Week in the comments box at checkout.
There's nothing like a nice cup of coffee outside on a spring day. Hello from the Roasting House. We're a small, family-owned coffee roastery based in South Yorkshire. We love coffee, but we're also passionate about protecting nature and trying to keep our footprint as small as we can. At the Roasting House, we offer delicious coffees from around the world, carefully selected from farms that use nature-friendly methods such as shade growing, soil conservation, and maintaining wild areas for native wildlife. We roast in small batches using an energy-efficient roaster and filter the smoke to remove carbon to reduce air pollution. Roasting House coffee is packed in home compostable packaging, and we know that it actually breaks down because we've tested it in our own compost heap and worm farm. Order at roastinghouse.co.uk, and if you mention Roots and All or the Insect of the Week at checkout, we'll send you 25% extra free coffee as a thank you for supporting us.
The dark-edged bee fly. Scientific name Bombilius major. Today's insect of the week is a bee fly. Bee flies are fascinating and fantastic little things. I've chosen probably the most common species in the UK and Ireland, just to kind of highlight a species that you may well see in your garden or in a park. And the dark-edged bee fly, as quite a few of the bee flies do, is enacting Batesian mimicry once again. So this fly has evolved to look like a bee and therefore appear more dangerous or less palatable to possible predators. Bee flies neither bite nor sting. This particular bee fly is parasitizing mining bees. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. The scientific name Bombilius major. So Bombilius comes from ancient Greek, relating to a buzzing insect. Major, the second word, is Latin, meaning greater. So this is the largest and most common species of the Bombilius genus. There's other ones, Bombilius minor, and I think Bombilius media. So it's just relating to this being the bigger species of that genus. Not a particularly technical scientific name, but worth knowing. They are often found when it's quite hot or warm. So the Natural History Museum suggests more than 17 degrees Celsius is when you usually see them. You often notice them basking in the sun if they're not up to their reproductive strategy, which I'm just about to talk about. So I think this is a bit of a fascinating story. I've been told a few times by different naturalists and entomologists, but the female bee fly is looking to lay her eggs in the nest of a mining bee in this particular species. So the Andrena mining bees, it never specifies which one, but I think it's some of the common species, Andrena bicolor, species like that. And so the female, prior to egg laying, gathers sand or grit. And this is to kind of camouflage her eggs, but to also add ballast to her eggs, which is really cool. So she flicks her eggs into the nests of mining bees. So mining bees in the ground, and those little holes you might see on the ground with the female mining bees going in and out. And she's trying to flick her eggs into there. So she wants to add a bit of ballast, a bit of weight. So the female bee fly gathers tiny bits of silica or grit to add weight and ballast to the eggs. So she then flicks them into the nest of the mining bees, which I just think is crazy. I just love that. And you sometimes see them kind of hovering and flicking their legs around the nest of mining bees. So just absolutely mad stuff. But the bee fly larvae are quite brutal. So they hatch out, then they move quickly to eat the pollen stores, which are intended for the bees, the mining bees young. Then they go through a second metamorphosis. So then they reach another state, which is not that common. And then they eat the bee larvae. So they're quite brutal. So they've eaten the pollen and then they eat the bee larvae.
But as always with these relationships through evolution, they sound brutal, and they are, but the hosts are never going to be completely wiped out. Otherwise, this system just wouldn't work through evolution. So the hosts and the parasites are all important. I think this is a particularly brutal sounding one, but it's worth telling the story. There are quite a few doppelgangers of this species, but this is the most common one. The female and the male both have a dark edge to the wing. So the body itself is kind of like a brown or buff colored body, hairy body. And then the wings have got the dark edge. So this black band at the top of the wing on both sides. There's doppelganger species, which might be things like the heath bee fly or the dotted bee fly. So always worth getting good pictures, just in case you've got one of the rarer ones. That'll be really cool as well. So as always, I really hope you've been seeing this species out and about over the last month or so. Please do record any sightings of bee flies or flies on the iRecord or iNaturalist app. And if you've got anything exciting, please do tag me, and I'd love to see it.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.